The winter of 1946 had no warmth left in Europe. The war had ended. But for thousands of former German prisoners of war, the silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. They were men without a country, without papers, without purpose. Across the ruins of Munich and Bremen, they built shacks from splintered boards and tar paper, huddling near burned churches and empty rail yards. Some still wore the same uniforms they had surrendered in, their insignias cut away, their eyes hollow from months in Allied camps. A U.S. Army report estimated that over 3.4 million German soldiers had been captured across Europe. By 1946, many were released, but most had no homes to return to. Cities were ashes, families scattered, in makeshift refugee camps. The men were known only by the numbers tattooed on their rations cards. We were ghosts. One former sergeant remembered, Germany no longer needed us, America no longer wanted us, and God had forgotten us. Then, one gray morning near a town in the Rhineland, a sound broke the stillness, the low rumble of trucks on frozen roads. Children peeked out from doorways, expecting soldiers, but the vehicles bore a white banner with red letters that read, American Relief Administration, and on one truck, nailed to a plank, another sign fluttered in the cold wind. It read, in clumsy German handwriting, Jobs for the Lost. At first, no one moved. Men who had once commanded tanks and squadrons now stood barefoot in mud, staring at a word they had not heard in years, jobs. Not charity, not surrender, not punishment work. An American officer stepped down from the truck, passing out small leaflets printed with the offer, labor for reconstruction, fair pay, no uniforms required. For a moment, no one dared to believe it was real. But the air changed. One man took a step forward, then another. A broken world was suddenly whispering that they were still needed. The wind carried the sign's creak across the empty valley, and for the first time since the war ended, a handful of forgotten men felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath their despair, the weight of their own name returning. The handshake happened on a misty morning in early 1947 in a small farming town near Koblenz. Karl Fischer, once a Wehrmacht mechanic, stood uncertainly at the gate of a wheat farm marked with an American flag. He had been sent there through a local employment office established by the U.S. military government, one of dozens created under JCS Directive 1067, which encouraged German reconstruction through supervised labor. He wore a patched jacket, carried no papers, and still flinched when he saw American uniforms. The farmer waiting for him was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named William Harlan, a former U.S. infantry sergeant who had fought in France. When Karl stopped a few steps away, Harlan extended his hand. For a moment, Karl didn't move. He had spent years trained to see that uniform as the face of the enemy. But the man's eyes were calm, not proud, not pitying. We both wore uniforms once, Harlan said quietly. Now we wear work shirts. Karl's hand trembled as he took it. The handshake was firm, not staged, not symbolic. It was human. And that simple contact skin against skin, not glove against glove, broke something inside him. He looked down, unable to hold back tears. In the following weeks, Karl worked from dawn till dusk repairing broken plows and helping rebuild irrigation pumps. The American farmer paid him 3 Reichsmarks a day, plus meals. It was not much. But for a man who had survived on army bread and shame, it was a resurrection. At lunch, they shared black coffee and cornbread. Harlan's wife sometimes joined, asking shy questions about Karl's family back home. There were awkward silences, moments when war ghosts flickered between them, once, while mending a fence. Harlan mentioned he had lost a brother at Bastogne. Karl froze, his mouth dry. He wanted to say, I'm sorry, but the words didn't come. Later that evening, he left a repaired wrench on the doorstep, polished clean, as his silent apology. By spring, the farm's wheat fields glowed gold again. Neighbors who had doubted the program began to hire former POWs as well. The regional report later noted that over 12,000 German laborers found private employment through American-sponsored contracts that year. Karl's diary from that time still exists, its ink faded but legible. One entry reads, I thought my hands were made for destruction. Today they built something that will feed children. Maybe that is how forgiveness begins. The handshake that morning had not just started a job. It had begun the slow reconstruction of a man's soul. In late 1947, an unusual request arrived at Camp Darmstadt, one of the remaining POW transit centers. A group of former Luftwaffe engineers were summoned not to be interrogated, but to assist in repairing industrial machinery in the nearby American-managed zone. They expected suspicion, perhaps humiliation. Instead, when they entered the workshop in Wiesbaden, they found fresh blue overalls laid out for them and an American supervisor holding a clipboard who simply asked, "Do you know how to work as a team?" The question startled them. In Germany, teams had meant hierarchy. One man gave orders, the others obeyed. Here, it meant cooperation. Hans Meyer, once a flight technician for the Focke-Wulf aircraft division, later wrote in his notes, "In the Reich, we followed commands without thought. In this place, they asked us to think for ourselves." The workshop was part of a quiet experiment run by the Office of Military Government, United States OMGUS. Its goal was to employ technical specialists in reconstructing equipment for local utilities within 6 months. Over 5,000 German engineers were contributing to power restoration, telephone repair, and machinery maintenance paid wages, supervised but trusted. The Wiesbaden workshop smelled of oil and iron, but also of coffee, real American coffee, brewed twice a day for everyone. The engineers noticed how even the janitor was addressed as Mr. one afternoon. When an American foreman asked Hans for advice on recalibrating a motor, he felt something he had not felt since before the war: respect. At first, the work was mechanical sorting broken turbines, drawing wiring diagrams, patching valves scavenged from bombed factories. But soon the collaboration deepened. Americans asked the Germans for solutions, not obedience. When one machine refused to start, an engineer named Otto suggested rerouting the line using spare aircraft parts. The foreman nodded. "Try it." Otto stared. No permission form, no stamp, no chain of command, just trust. It worked. The generator hummed back to life, flooding the dim workshop with light. The Americans clapped. The Germans stood in stunned silence. That evening, over dinner, Otto muttered, "At home, this idea would have needed 3 approvals." Hans smiled faintly. "At home, this idea would have been forbidden." The shift was invisible but immense, from control to collaboration, from fear to curiosity. For these men, the workshop was not just a place of labor, it was a classroom of democracy disguised as industry. Outside, snow began to fall through the frosted windows. The faint glow of the generator reflected on the men's faces, a reminder that sometimes the first spark of freedom begins not in speeches, but in the sound of a machine reborn. By 1948, the U.S. occupation had turned from punishment to rebuilding. Schools reopened, factories restarted, and technical classes were established under the Marshall Plan. Among the students was a 26-year-old former German POW named Dieter Keller, thin, quiet, and carrying a small notebook everywhere. Dieter had been a radio operator captured in Normandy, now in a classroom inside a refurbished gymnasium in Heidelberg. He sat among other ex-soldiers, trying to learn the mathematics of electricity from an American teacher. Her name was Mary Whitman, a 35-year-old engineer from Ohio, sent by the United States Educational Mission to Germany. She had lost her husband in the war. When she entered the classroom that first day, the men stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to salute or sit. She smiled gently and said, "Let's start with circuits, not ranks." Laughter rippled through the room, a fragile, human sound that none had heard in years. Dieter listened intently. His English was broken, but his mind was sharp. He copied every word she wrote on the board, every diagram of resistors and currents. During breaks, while others smoked outside, he stayed behind to ask questions: how transformers worked, how sound became radio waves. Mary noticed his hunger to learn and began lending him old textbooks. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, she asked, "Why do you study so hard, Dieter? You already know more than most." He hesitated, then replied softly, "Because I never want to hold a weapon again. I want to hold tools." The room fell silent. Behind those few words lay the weight of millions. That summer, under a U.S.-sponsored initiative called Operation University, more than 350,000 Germans enrolled in re-education and vocational programs. Former POWs like Dieter became electricians, machinists, and teachers. They learned not only skills, but a new philosophy that dignity could come from creation. not conquest. Mary often ended her lessons with simple gestures, bringing homemade sandwiches, teaching them English idioms, once even inviting them to a local music recital. The first time Dieter heard a violin playing in that hall, he felt tears rise without knowing why. The melody had no flag, no orders, no victory. It was just sound, alive and free. Years later, Dieter wrote in a letter to her, "You taught me that rebuilding is harder than destroying, but also far more beautiful." In that small classroom, surrounded by the smell of chalk and ink, a generation of former enemies began to rediscover humanity through the quiet rhythm of education. By the spring of 1949, Germany was stirring again. Factories once filled with dust and silence now roared with the rhythm of machines. One of them stood on the outskirts of Hamburg, a mechanical plant rebuilt with funds from the Marshall Plan's $13 billion reconstruction program. Half of its workers were former POWs. The other half, American technicians sent to train them. Together, they forged not just steel, but a fragile peace. The factory's name was Nordwerk Engineering, and its first product was not a weapon, but a line of agricultural machinery meant to replant the soil that war had burned. Every morning, a siren called hundreds of workers to their stations. Some still wore old field jackets, the edges of military insignias barely visible beneath grease stains. Others carried lunchboxes marked U.S. Army surplus. They spoke a mixed language of broken English and mended German. Among them was Carl Fischer, the same man who had once wept at an American handshake. He now oversaw a small team of welders, reporting to an American engineer named Thomas Reed. The two worked side by side, arguing, laughing, solving problems with gestures more than words. One evening, as they watched sparks leap from the assembly line, Reed said, "We used to build bombs, Carl. Now we're building tractors." Carl nodded slowly. Maybe both were meant to change the world. Only one will feed it. In the cafeteria, workers sang folk songs after long shifts. A journalist visiting from the Times described it as a place where peace hums louder than politics. At the end of the first production year, Nordwerk shipped over 2,000 machines, many of them exported to farms in France and Italy, lands that had once been battlefields. But the transformation was not just industrial, it was human. Carl's team began collecting scraps of metal from the old Wehrmacht warehouses and melting them down to cast new gears. One worker joked, "Maybe this gear used to be a gun." Another replied, "Then let's make sure it never becomes one again." The laughter that followed was not mockery, it was cleansing. In moments like these, history felt reversible. Two nations, once locked in mortal combat, now shared blueprints and coffee breaks. One photograph from 1949 shows the entire factory floor, Germans and Americans, shoulder to shoulder, beneath a banner that read, "From work comes renewal." Could compassion truly rebuild a nation faster than conquest ever destroyed it? And if it could, what would that mean for how we define victory itself? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. What does winning mean when both sides learn to build together? The autumn of 1949 came with gray skies and cautious hope. Letters began to move again across the Atlantic, carried by postal bags marked U.S. Army, Civil Affairs. Among them was one written in blue ink on thin paper, its corners softened by travel. It came from a man in Hamburg and was addressed to a small apartment in Munich. "Dear Mother," it began, "I am working for the Americans. Please do not be angry. They do not treat me as a defeated man. They say, 'If you do good work, you help Germany stand again.' I believe them." The letter was signed simply, "Your son, Wilhelm." It was one of thousands like it. Allied monitors, reading through correspondence to ensure no subversion, noted with surprise the recurring theme gratitude. In a report dated November 1949, U.S. administrators found that nearly 70% of letters from employed former POWs expressed positive attitudes toward Reconstruction and American fairness. Some included small tokens drawings of new workshops, sketches of rebuilt streets, pressed flowers from factory gardens. Wilhelm's mother read his letter at her kitchen table, beside a chipped mug and a candle stub. She had survived bombings, hunger, and rumors that German men were being sent to Siberia. Now, she wept not from fear, but from relief. Her son had found not just work, but dignity. Across the American zone, Programs known as Arbeitsämter der Versöhnung labor offices of reconciliation helped coordinate over 400,000 placements for ex-prisoners. Many of these jobs came with education grants, basic housing, and even community gatherings where Americans and Germans shared meals. At one such event in Bremen, a band played both Yankee Doodle and Lily Marlene to equal applause. Inside the Nordwerk plant, Karl read Wilhelm's letter aloud during a break. Around him, men listened silently, some smiling, others staring into their coffee. "They say work can cleanse," Karl murmured. "Maybe they are right." Thomas Reed, the American engineer, answered softly. "It's not the work, Karl. It's the chance." By the end of that year, something remarkable had happened. Several Americans who had trained German teams chose to stay. They married local women, opened small shops, or continued teaching vocational classes. A Chicago newspaper ran a headline, "Enemies yesterday, colleagues today." So let me ask you, the listener, what do you think changes a man more defeat, or being given another chance? Can mercy be more revolutionary than victory itself? History, it seems, was quietly answering yes, one letter, one handshake, one day of honest work at a time. By the early 1950s, Europe's wounds had begun to scar over, trains ran again, children played where rubble had once stood, and men who had known nothing but war learned to measure time by factory whistles instead of air raid sirens. Among them was Karl Fischer. He had saved every wage slip since that first day on Harlan's farm. By 1952, he had enough to lease a small workshop in Hamburg, a dim, drafty building with a tin roof and one surviving machine press salvaged from a scrapyard. Above the doorway, he painted a simple sign, "Fischer Mechanic." At first, his only customers were neighbors who brought broken tools or bicycles. Within 2 years, the shop employed 8 men, 3 former POWs like him, and 5 local apprentices. One afternoon, Karl invited an American visitor to see his shop. It was Thomas Reed, his old supervisor from Nordwerk. They walked between benches stacked with steel rods and gears. The walls were lined with black and white photographs, workers smiling beside tractors. A harvest field from Texas, and a faded picture of 2 men shaking hands in 1947. Karl pointed at that photograph and said, "This is where my life began again." Reed studied it for a long time. "No," he replied softly. "It began the moment you believed you still had something to give." The factory's steady hum filled the air, a rhythm almost like breathing. When asked years later by a journalist what changed him most, Karl said, "They didn't save me with money. They saved me by making me useful again." By the late 1950s, the small workshop had grown into a modest company producing spare parts for agricultural machines, the same machines once built with American aid. When Karl's son took over decades later, he kept the original sign and the photograph of the handshake framed beside it. Archival records show that more than 700,000 former German POWs eventually reintegrated through work programs tied to Allied assistance. Economists now credit this labor force with accelerating West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed a defeated nation into an industrial power within a decade. But numbers alone could never tell the deeper truth. For Karl, for Wilhelm, for Dieter, redemption had not arrived in grand speeches or treaties. It had come through the simple dignity of being needed again, through hands blackened with grease, through laughter in the lunch hall, through the shared silence of men who had learned to build instead of destroy. As the years passed, Karl often left his workshop door open so he could hear the sound of the machines while he drank his evening coffee. That hum, he said, was the sound of life continuing the proof that war had lost, and humanity had quietly won. The story of these men, the forgotten soldiers who found purpose through labor, is not one of easy redemption, but of gradual awakening. When the war ended, they were hollowed by guilt, fear, and hunger. Yet, step by step, hammer by hammer, they rebuilt not only their country, but their sense of worth. In a world still shrouded by ashes, work became the quiet language of forgiveness. Karl's workshop in Hamburg, Dieter's classroom in Heidelberg, Wilhelm's letter to his mother, each was a thread in a vast human tapestry woven between former enemies. None of them planned to make history. They simply worked, repaired, studied, and hoped. But through those simple acts, they proved that peace is not declared by treaties alone. It is built in sweat and silence, in the way one man hands another a tool instead of a weapon, When historians later studied the post-war years, they found the statistics astonishing: the Marshall Plan's billions, the millions of jobs created, the exponential rise of industrial output. Yet behind every number stood faces men who had once marched in arrogance and later bent down in humility to plant seeds, forge metal, teach children, and fix power lines. In the end, what defeated hatred was not punishment, but participation, not ideology, but inclusion. The Americans had understood something subtle yet profound, that giving the defeated a role in rebuilding would disarm bitterness more effectively than any tribunal. Sometimes, late at night, Carl would still hear the echo of rivet guns in his dreams, but the sound no longer frightened him. It reminded him of rebirth, the heartbeat of a world choosing creation over ruin. And perhaps that is the truest measure of victory, when those who once destroyed are taught to build again, and the noise of machinery replaces the thunder of guns.